I promise we weren't at the bar. We were just, just having a little tete-a-tete. And I've just completely stuffed John's news feed, so I apologise if I'm taking out all of the Appleware, sorry Nigel, to get your questions. Now I know we don't need to reiterate your background, we've heard enough. But it was wonderful, and we do want to go into the part about your legacy a little bit more in this session. But Nigel, we don't know yet. Nigel Parker is Director of the Developer Experience at Microsoft New Zealand. It's an impressive title, but he's obviously a techie, or what we would call a techie at heart, and thankfully for our entrepreneurial community here in New Zealand, he is a huge supporter of investors, and an investor of startups. He does a huge amount for our community here in New Zealand, nationwide, outside of what he does in Microsoft. He is deeply passionate about innovation and has a litany of milestones at Microsoft, which I won't not bore you with, but now my name is Alex Mercer, as you have heard, and I'm here to translate. I'm here to translate this conversation between the technical, the philanthropy, and to be quite transparent, I worked at Microsoft many moons ago, showing my age, in Seattle, and then went on to work for Bill Gates' office on the Giving Pledge specifically, hence the Rockefeller connection, which was a critical reason why the Giving Pledge actually successfully landed. There was early on, before the Giving Pledge even launched, the Rockefeller family were well involved there. So I'm delighted to actually meet Justin. So to begin, I want to pick up where we left off earlier today, Justin, about your legacy. And I know you were put on the spot, but it actually was very relevant to the technology discussion that we want to have today. And you talked about the opportunity to collect data, analyze it, and then share it so that the entire field had the opportunity to benefit from it. And we know that with good insight come make good decisions, and that more than ever, a donor can get tangible insight into the results of their giving, and organisations can collect and manage and analyse their data effectively for better decision making. But tell us a little bit more about the impact.org and Adapar as an investor in startups, and how that has driven analysis of investable organisations.
Thank you, and happy to do so. I guess for AV, if there's a slide about the impact, now might make sense. Okay, cool. So let me get a little bit of background on where this came from. So I think any organization or any entrepreneur who starts an organization, a company, et cetera, at some level does so with dissatisfaction with the status quo. That you embrace your frustration that something in the world isn't the way that it's supposed to be, so I'm just going to make it that way, or push in that direction. So I don't think the impact was any different. So my co-founder and I went to a lot of family office conferences and impact investing conferences, and if you asked people to raise their hand about who was interested in impact investing, many hands went up around the room. But if you ask them to keep their hand up if they've actually been making impact investments, very few hands actually stayed up. So those were the people that we identified and went to go talk to. Why are you interested but not yet doing? And the answer was almost always the same. We don't have a good sense as to what works and what doesn't work. People have been doing this for years. What are the results? So we thought there needs to be an organization that collects those results and presents them in an accessible way to those who want an on-ramp into impact investing. So it's not so intimidating. And really by impact, I'm talking about values-aligned investing. We can talk about the terminology. Impact investing is kind of the term that's won. but values-aligned investing is probably the broader umbrella. That's really what we're talking about here. So the impact, first of all, it is a nonprofit. It technically has yet to launch publicly. So we're not talking about it much in the press, but we're waiting to find the right executive director. It's a nonprofit, and the mission is to increase the pace and the probability of addressing and solving, hopefully, social problems by facilitating the flow of capital to businesses generating measurable social impact. That's a horrible pickup line in a bar. That's a mouthful, but we thought long and hard about the mission statement. And so I mentioned earlier what the pact is, and it has several components. It might be on the next slide. Clicker here. Thank you very much. The power is in the technology.
Except when you don't break it.
So this is what constitutes the impact. It's a network of families, and there are three components. Make impact investments, track the financial performance and the social impact. Again, that data comes from the investors themselves in whom you're investing, and then share those data with others who have made the pact. And I'll just run through these, but the point is that in terms of the impact metrics, we're starting with 5 buckets. Every impact investment has these characteristics, and the software provided pro bono by Adipar, which is the company where I work. I won't spend time on that now, but you can look it up for more detail. You can assign attributes to securities. And so you're able to collect through direct data feeds and through batch uploads of Excel documents down to the transaction level all of your values-aligned investments or impact investments. And then we can assign, using the software, these categories to each of those investments. But then you could go multiple layers deeper with each of these. So take impact strategy, for example. Not everything fits perfectly into one of those buckets. Sometimes they fit into multiple buckets. Sometimes you really want to talk about the sublayers. The software covers all of that, and none of this would be possible without that software. So we can have a network of families, but there are already networks of families in the impact investing space. Another one wasn't necessarily needed. What was needed was focus on the outputs of all of these investments rather than just the inputs. Rather than say, hey, we think impact investing is a good idea, it's going to make the world a better place, you should try it. Not so compelling. So if people are philanthropically inclined, we want them to be able to make a pact to do this. Don't just talk about it, but really make a pact to do it. Give them a period of time, probably let's call it 12, 18 months to start doing it, but then have that on-ramp. Have that accessible information by having a click-through menu of other people who have made the pact. Rockefeller Brothers Fund, as I discussed earlier, has already made the pact. Other foundations and well-known individuals have made the pact. So their data is now live in the system, and it updates daily. So rather than asking them what's working and what's not working, you can make the pact. It's free to make the pact, and then log in, and you only get a login after you've made the pact, and look through their portfolios. And the beauty is that they can see everything about their own portfolio in a way that they haven't been able to before because of the technology, but they can actually control what others get to see of their portfolio. So if you feel like you don't want to share certain details, you don't have to. But we think that as you start to share and as you start to learn from others, you're going to be more willing to share. Think of the early days of LinkedIn or Wikipedia. Not particularly useful for anyone who visits the site, but because of the nature of network effects, the more people who contribute, the more people who participate, the more valuable the network becomes. You can probably leave it there. There are about 15 more slides, but we can come back to that if you want.
I do want you to mention, though, about its setup and when it's available. It did come up in the news feed this morning, which I didn't access in time.
No problem. So the setup is essentially as follows. Let's say that you as an individual decide to make the pact. Well, then you would be in touch with me probably, or the staff, and then you would send a letter of authorization to your bank. That bank has a data feed. Adipar, the for-profit, has a data feed already built to that bank, depending on the bank. And then that letter of authorization starts the daily feeds into the system. And then we go through with you and categorize your impact portfolio as you want it to, as you want to see it yourself and as you want others to see it. And then you get this login, and then you can, again, see your own portfolio and that of others. For illiquid investments like alts and other what we call offline data, there's a way to upload data, just taking an Excel spreadsheet, sending it to us securely, and then we can load it into the system with a few clicks. I don't remember the second part of the question, I'm sorry.
It was more that it's not yet quite.
Oh, right, fair enough. Okay, so we have not yet publicly launched the impact because I can't handle the inbound interest if we launch publicly. We need an executive director in place, and we've been looking for a little bit of a unicorn in this space. Someone with gravitas and credibility and entrepreneurial chops who really understands the family office world.
And no, you can't have anybody from New Zealand. Everybody here.
So we're pretty close to finding this person. And then once we do, we'll get a launch strategy in place. We'll launch publicly. But the data itself is live. The platform is real. It's live. So you can actually make the pact. But we're not talking about it too much publicly now, despite what you're seeing before your very eyes. Yeah. Just starting to right now.
You realize we're on Twitter right now.
Here's your preview right now.
Nigel, you thought you got off scot-free, but can you tell us about some of the work you're doing around the data insights and some of the really how you're utilising the results and impact?
Yeah, sure. I'll start off by saying I was fascinated in the talk this morning with Justin, where he talked about the Rockefeller family and the start with the investment in oil, and how the Rockefeller Brothers Fund is is getting out of the investment in oil and fossil fuels and moving into these services like the impact and working with Adipar. From my view, I actually see data as the new oil. It is the knowledge economy that technology is moving towards. So I think about software companies actually becoming data companies in the future. And that's really translating from every small organisation right through to massive enterprise organisations that are adding value through not just the data that's being collected, because we're collecting a lot more information these days than we did a little while ago, but the insight and prediction and causality that comes from the data that's being collected. In New Zealand specifically, we've been working with the Citizens Advice Bureau, and it's an interesting organisation because it's an organisation that's been around for a long, long time, but it's one that continues to add a lot of service to the citizens of this country. I was amazed to find that there's 650,000 connections that are made by the Citizens Advice Bureau annually. And that equates to maybe one connection every 11 seconds during a working week, which is a massive number of people who are contacting through the service to get advice, to provide insight, or to respond to challenges that they're having in their own lives. And what we found is when we started working with them is there was no system to actually collect and collate that information together to create continuity, because the people who were volunteering to offer the service were strictly that, volunteers who were coming in with an ear and some expertise and some advice around listening and also giving back. And our working with the Citizens Advice Bureau was enabling us to actually create a system where that information could be shared and tracked. And not only being collected, it could also add value to all of the other stakeholders from government to public service that was getting what was really the pulse of the nation based on the impact at any point in time. So when we think about that, that's a massive opportunity that's always been there, but hasn't been captured and collated in a way that it can actually help others gain insight and provide outcomes based on the service that's already in place. And I think the more of that around the technology enabling what used to be maybe a manual process, where it was more communication and hearsay, to actually real-time inputs, whether it's through smart investment or whether it's through a service that can say, well, right now this policy is having this effect in this community based on these people calling the service. And then the government can respond with investment, and this community can respond with services that can help.
So there's a question from Kate McKeag in the audience, and this is actually around, it's sort of taking it from the other direction. How do businesses measure their own social impact? And so I'm hoping I'm saying it correctly, but from a corporate perspective, we're expecting impact to be measured by the NGO or by the organisation. How are corporates measuring their social impact?
Well, I can talk to that based on maybe the area that I have personal experience with. I specifically in my role is not to work with philanthropic organisations and to contribute to the sector, but I am a problem solver, and I am somebody who works across the industry to try and draw outcomes. And one of the things that we've realised is that the young people in New Zealand, there's a gap between the access to technology and information and the jobs and workforce that's available in order to be able to serve those jobs. So one of the measures that I've been working on is really how to work with the startups and the entrepreneurial businesses in New Zealand. And I run the startup program for Microsoft, so I've got quite a bit of experience in that. And how to actually fill the gaps between where they want to try and find work-ready graduates and also the education system that's creating those graduates. So we've come up with what we call a student accelerator program that's specifically designed to find motivated students, to inspire them and to train them, and then to take those students and collectively put them into organisations to be intentionally disruptive, to try something with new technology or to create some outcomes.
There might be a few in here.
So, and that program, I mean, it's in its second year at the moment, and we've partnered with the Careers Department at the University of Auckland. But the impact from doing that is not only to address the problem that exists, but to do so in a way that I feel that we can help. Now, how's that measurable? I can give you the numbers of who's been through and how many students have been placed and tell you some of the stories. But it's about actually being able to go and do something and then to say that you've actually done something and, you know, trace that back to the impact. I hope that answers.
Well, for me, might not for Kate. I want to jump around a little bit, and knowing that we're sort of short on time, we all agree that technology can solve some of the toughest issues we have societally in our world, and we have seen amazing inventions every single day around fighting poverty, disease, climate change, developing renewable energy, creating opportunities in education. What I'd love to do is look at the lay of the land around the NGO space and our rising stars and the for-profits as well. And what innovations are you seeing? What organisations are you seeing in both the not-for-profit area and the for-profits that really resonate?
I'll give a first go. So I wrote down a few. So I'll go through these very quickly, but just know I'm happy to go in more depth later. Khan Academy is one that many of you might know, and it's essentially free online education about specific subjects, and absolutely worth looking up, KHAN academy.org. It's a great tool for education.
It's wonderful.
Totally free. The Sal Khan has a natural way of explaining things, and it's free and accessible to everyone in the world who can access the internet, which is why it's so important to provide internet access around the world. DonorsChoose.org is much better known, I think, in the US than outside the US, but I think, anyway, it's what inspired Kiva.org, which is better known outside the United States. Very briefly, takes out the middleman when it comes to supporting education in the US. Teachers can, it was founded by a teacher, again, he was frustrated with the status quo, he embraced his frustration. His teachers didn't have the basic requirements for a proper education. So he built a website and said, help fund my classroom because we need pencils and we need textbooks. So it wasn't an abstract ask for support for a general school board, for example. It was very specific. And he would have his students write thank you letters to the donors and thank them for their support for these very specific things. That has scaled massively in the United States. I think hundreds of millions of dollars of support through Donors Choose. Crisis Text Line is another nonprofit, and this one actually needs more money and more support. The value is greater than how much it has been supported by society. Anyone having any type of emotional problem or in need of support can text for free this crisis hotline because young people trust the medium of text. And you can be somewhat anonymous when you do this. And it's just a safe place to start. But then the people who answer that, empowered by learning machines and algorithms, finding certain keywords, are licensed therapists who can then provide support. And if they detect child abuse or that someone might commit suicide, et cetera, they have very specific steps that they take. And this is already helping hundreds of thousands of people. Briefly, the X Prize is worth looking up. It's a different approach to philanthropy. So rather than funding the process, you fund the result by holding a big pile of cash, or increasingly a small pile of cash, and say if you hit these very specific goals, then you get the prize money. But in the process of pursuing the goal, the field is helped tremendously. The most famous example is private space aviation. Very quick examples on the for-profit side. A company called Palantir, named after the Palantir singing stones from Lord of the Rings. Very large and important data company in the United States. It helped the US government find bin Laden in Pakistan. It works with the FBI and the CIA and the military, et cetera. Very powerful data technology, works with a lot of nonprofits as well, and helps them. So for example, coordinating disaster relief after Hurricane Sandy, working across multiple police databases to aggregate and synthesize information to help find missing children much more quickly. Dozens of examples like this. I mentioned Adipar lending support to the Impact. That would cost probably hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, something that the Impact certainly couldn't afford. And then everyone is kind of nervous about drone-related companies. There is a company called Airware, which is using drones in part to help prevent poaching in Africa. There are a lot of good uses for this technology as well. The very last I'll mention, just as a sampling of the field, is one called Change.org. Despite the name, it's actually a for-profit company, and it's gotten quite large, very successful. And they sponsor campaigns. So anyone can launch a campaign for a specific issue, and then they galvanize support, and people vote for the campaign, and the campaign always has a very specific ask. So recently, President Obama responded to one of these campaigns and asked for states and Congress to ban what's called transition therapy, which has been proven not to work. This is a cause of suicide in young LGBT people, and their parents force them to go through, this ridiculous transition therapy, as if that could possibly work. Anyway, and it does lead to suicide. So that's now one example of, again, thousands of successful mobilization causes on organizations like change.org. Those are just a few examples from the for-profit side and the non-profit side. There are so many others.
Listening to what Justin's saying there, I think some of these come back to New Zealand examples as well. So if you're familiar with Wynyard Group out of Christchurch, they're doing work in the security area around children and the trafficking of children, as well as stopping the process of crime and investigation. In addition to that, we've been working, I mentioned through the student program that we've been operating. At Microsoft, we run a global technology competition for students, which is called the Imagine Cup. And that has about 250,000 students worldwide, over 120 countries that enter into that each year. In New Zealand, we have about 1% of that, about 2,000 students. But New Zealand teams have placed in the top 10 5 times in the last 6 years, winning the innovation section last year, which is really significant. And if I look at some of the teams that have come through that, maybe over the last 4 or 5 years, there was a team called UV Lens, which had the idea of wearable technology for UV sensors, and then they ended up pivoting on that idea and delivering UV sensors to early childhood education classrooms in New Zealand. And the interesting thing about this is that prior to doing that, the idea of putting on sunscreen or wearing hats was dictated by the time of the year. And the policy that those centres followed had nothing to do with the UV exposure. It was just based on, is it summer or not? And so, yeah, by putting in this system, it actually triggers an alert and lets the care centre know that it's time to put on sunscreen or time to wear protection. And then on the other side of that, it collects that data and stores that data over time to see UV trends in different parts of the country that can feed in to show exposure over time and to gain insight. So that's, that was a massive example. There was another example from a colleague of mine called Dimitri and his program called thoughtwired.com. And that was really started about empowering people with severe disabilities to communicate directly using brain interfaces. So we talk about technology as being an enabler. I think we're still accustomed to the idea of touching a screen or working on a keyboard. But technology in the future, it will be about getting out of the way and actually working the way that you work as opposed to you understanding how it works. And I think that leads to the idea of natural computing. And this concept here, it's kind of straight out of Avatar. It's the idea of being able to actually export yourself and use your mind to control what could be a robot or some other aspect in another place. And I tried this technology, and once you understand attention and meditation, you can actually learn the system and do everything from driving cars to interacting, turning on light bulbs, and working with software interfaces. So it's amazing technology. And those were a few local examples.
I think this is Viv Maderborn, but she makes a really interesting point that we've been talking about. It's fascinating that all social impact discussion is still either NGO or corporate. That's my lingo, that's my fault, and not social business talk as yet. When I took them to the bar, we talked a bit about the actual title for this Q&A, and that it kept tripping us up around talking about philanthropy and technology, because it has become so ubiquitous. Technology has now become so ubiquitous that it's social good, and I'm taking actually the words out of Justin's mouth, but it's social good and technology. It is social businesses, as Maderborn pulls out. I want to talk a little bit about the speed of change, which has been really brought about by the millennial culture. There was a big aha moment this morning when you were talking about millennials, and I know you probably hate talking about that particular area, but millennials are focused on the broader good, and it was something that we found with the Giving Pledge that was it was a pleasant surprise when the very wealthy technologists actually came up to the plate and became pledges as well. Mark and Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk and various others. You were talking earlier just with us around the trends in some of the grad schools. Can you talk a little bit about that? It's off the technology radar, but it's a really interesting trend.
Yeah. So first of all, if anyone has any doubts about the relevance and future of technology, look up any of the many YouTube videos of a 6-month-old swiping, his tablet on and knowing what to do with the phone or the tablet. I don't know the exact numbers here, but they're easily searchable on Bing. That's a fist bump. There you go.
I'm just hiding my phone.
You can give me the $10 later.
I'll give you 50.
So easily searchable, and basically some of the top business schools in the United States, like Harvard Business School, Stanford Business School, Wharton Business School, many others, the most popular clubs on campus are the social entrepreneurship clubs and the impact investing clubs, the social business clubs. Just look at the numbers and tomorrow's leaders, so to speak. This is what they're interested in. So I don't have the exact numbers, but I think at each of those are three of the most popular clubs, if not the three most popular clubs.
And then similarly, Nigel, on talk to us about some of the trends that you've seen around social media, creating movements through social media and crowdfunding.
I guess there's been a couple. I think the snowball effect that's come out of the Ice House, that's New Zealand's first equity crowdsourced platform in New Zealand. And that's been funding everything from craft beer to drones to social good organisations. And I think that enables the individual to invest in a cause that they care about, which doesn't require necessarily working into an investment fund or a larger group. I've also noticed personally investing through network. So myself, I stupidly invest in tech startup companies in New Zealand and lose a lot of money doing so. But
Don't put them off.
I'm not put off anyone in the room. It's like the high impact, high reward investment, because you just need one to work and it drives away and it's very successful. But the reason for doing that is partly because these organisations, they're already self-funded and really motivated. And I find that when you are connected via social channels, you have a large network, and it's easier to invest in somebody in your network or an idea in your network that has real passion and real outcomes that you can demonstrate, as opposed to maybe the traditional idea of being a donor and investing on the heartstrings of something that's less connected or less defined based on personal values. And I see a trend in that direction from, which does create movements, and that's happened multiple times within the last few years in New Zealand as well.
We've just got a couple more minutes, and I don't want to go away or let anybody leave the room until they've. You can talk through, as we look to sort of leveraging the technology in all of our own organisations. If you could pick 2 or 3 priorities or takeaways or pieces of advice for each of us to leave with today, what would they be? Who wants to go first?
I'll out-polite you on this one. Yeah.
Sure. I think it's really important for the people in this room to, dive in and take an interest in technology. And it could be as simple as attending what we call a meetup. There's a place on meetup.com where there's lots of user groups get together and like-minded people talk about a passion. And if you go along to one of those, it's like going along to a cooking class. You might sit there and not really understand what's happening up the front, but you can see the end result and you can understand that the passion will rub off on you. And then the second side of this is, if you do have some ideas or if you're blocked by technology, do consider looking at our Student Accelerator and taking on a team of young people to address that problem or to be disruptive within your own organisations. We had a team work with St John's last year, and it was really impactful in what they produced. We had another team at the warehouse. And these are specific outcomes that can be driven and also rewarding for the organizations themselves.
I might just add to that this is a good opportunity to embrace the 12-year-old daughter, as we were talking about earlier, or the 23-year-old recent graduate in your organization, and really listen to them. What's trending right now? What are the apps that you use? How do you get information? And listen to them, because they're probably fairly representative of how others are doing it. And those are the people you want to reach. So, yeah, why don't I leave it there? I'd say, yeah.
Have we, how many more minutes? We've got one or two. Have we got one more question? Okay. There's an interesting one here. It might be for you, Nigel, actually. Okay. Precious Clark talks about, where do we take our first, and I'm personally biased here, where do we take our first steps to shift New Zealand's primary sector focus, not to the 3D printer to print out leather strips, but to focus on our own technology industry sector? Yeah,
it's an interesting question, because I've probably got some direct examples working in that space. I think if you take it back to technology as an enabler, a technology solution can augment or improve process for any organisation. We've done some recent work with Plunkett as well, which was really around getting the 800 nurses who go and visit the 91% of babies born in New Zealand, and enabling them using the idea of user-centric design. So build a system that works the way they work, and then sits next to them and makes their life easier so that they can focus on the outcomes. And then the reward they get along the way is that if there's a breaking, if the data that they collect actually shows that there's an outbreak of whooping cough in a particular area, that might create insight that you wouldn't have otherwise had. So in anything from, it's not so much about creating efficiencies, I mean, that's part of it. I think it's also about looking at a different way of doing things based on the technology that's available to do it.
Great. Thank you both for inspiring us and challenging us all to think strategically about how we can take advantage of technology for the love of humanity, to take Kate's words from this morning. Just like you to put your hands together for Justin and